The A330 A340 family has an enhanced ground proximity warning system, GPWS. Its purpose is to enhance safety by alerting the crew to potentially hazardous situations involving terrain collision or incorrect landing configuration. GPWS basics functions are always covers below 2,450 feet radio altimeter, excessive rate of descent, excessive terrain closure rate, altitude loss after takeoff or go around, unsafe terrain clearance when not in landing configuration, and excessive deviation below glide slope. GPWS adds enhanced functions based on a worldwide terrain database: Terrain Awareness Display, TAD, Terrain Clearance Floor, TCF, and Runway Field Clearance Floor, RFCF.
The GPWS monitors the aircraft flight path and generates visual and audio warnings alerts when the aircraft is in one of the defined hazardous situations. These warnings will be overridden by stall or wind shear warnings.
The GPWS processes the data from Radio Altimeter 1, ADIRS 1, ILS 1, GPS, FCU 1 and 2, LGCIU 1. Note: FMGS 1 is backup. The GPWS may predict the terrain conflict by uses of obstacles, terrain, and airports database. It integrates present position from GPS, FMGS1 as backup, track, ground speed, and geometric altitude from pressure altitude, GPS altitude, radio altitude, and terrain database. Note: on the basic GPWS, alerts and warnings are generated as a result of changes in radio altimeter heights. The system predicts potential hazards from these trends, but has no forward-looking capability. The GPWS control panel is located on the left side of the overhead panel. GPWS visual warnings are provided on the main instrument panel. The system can be tested by pressing either pull-up GPWS push-button switch. This test is normally performed by the maintenance crew. In addition, 2 loudspeakers broadcast GPWS warnings even if they are turned off. GPWS enhances safety by alerting, warning the crew of potentially hazardous situations during flight at low heights. Crews should react to any GPWS warning immediately without attempting to assess its validity. GPWS operation is fully automatic in the normal lights out configuration. We will now study the aural and visual alerts and warnings. If a high rate of descent is detected at low level, the GPWS will generate an oral, repeated, sync rate alert and the GPWS lights will illuminate. If this rate is, or becomes excessive, the repetitive oral warning, pull up, will be generated and the red pull-up lights will illuminate. If rising ground is detected as a potential threat to the safety of the aircraft, the GPWS will alert the crew with a repeated, terrain, oral alert and the GPWS lights will illuminate. The system will generate a pull-up warning after the terrain alert has been repeated twice and the red pull-up lights will illuminate. If the GPWS detects a rate of descent during the initial climb after takeoff or following a go-around, it will give a repeated, don't sink, alert with the amber GPWS lights.
At very low levels, the oral warning
Too low here.
will be generated if the landing gear is still retracted. If the landing gear is down, but the flaps are not in landing configuration, the warning is
Too low flap.
note that the
Too low here.
warning has priority over the
Too low flap.
Below approximately 1,000 feet on an approach, a GPWS glide slope oral and visual alert will be generated if the runway is ILS equipped, the ILS is tuned, the ILS signal is valid, the aircraft is significantly below the glide slope. Both amber GPWS lights will illuminate.
Glide slope.
The oral message will become louder to indicate a warning if no corrective action is taken as the aircraft gets closer to the ground, or if it descends further below the glide slope. Note that some airports around the world have approaches and departures which are not compatible with standard GPWS operation. These airports are programmed into the GPWS database, and the warning thresholds are modified to avoid nuisance warnings. The GPWS panel allows the crew to inhibit some warnings.
Flap 3 is a recognized landing configuration. If the option is used, or if required, by an ECAM procedure, the crew should select Landing Configuration 3 on the MCDU to ensure that the GPWS does not generate warnings when it detects that the aircraft is not in the full flap configuration. Following some failures, a landing may have to be made with a reduced flap setting. The crew can select the flap mode push button switch off to inhibit GPWS flap warnings. If the flap mode is off, the green GPWS flap off message is displayed on the engine warning display. When selected off, the glide slope mode push button switch will inhibit the GPWS glide slope warning. The white off light illuminates when the GPWS is selected off. All warnings are inhibited. With the eGPWS, a forward-looking capability for terrain is added. eGPWS correlates the current position to terrain and a worldwide terrain database, and not on radar returns. The purpose of the GPWS is to avoid a controlled flight into terrain, CFIT, and to give enough time to the crew to perform an avoidance maneuver. On the MD, except in plan mode, the weather radar image is replaced by the terrain picture if the TAR on ND is selected on. The display of the GPWS terrain computer data is different from the ground picture sensed by the radar. The image texture is different. There is a blue TAR indication instead of the radar tilt, and lowest and highest elevations encountered within the selected range ahead of the aircraft are displayed in a square in colored code areas. The terrain elevation surrounding the aircraft is color-coded, depending on the current aircraft's altitude. At low aircraft relative altitude, flight between minimum and maximum elevation numbers, the terrain elevation surrounding the aircraft appears in different colors and densities. At high aircraft relative altitude, flight above the maximum elevation number, the relief between the minimum and maximum elevation is indicated by 3 different shades of green. Two TAR on ND push-button switch are fitted on each side of the main panel. To display the terrain picture on his ND, the pilot will have to switch on his respective TAR on ND push-button switch. Note: the weather radar information is replaced even if it is switched on. If an alert is generated, the terrain picture will be presented on both NDs without pilot action. In the lights out position, the GPWS operation is fully automatic. The TAR push button switch in the off position allows the crew to inhibit the enhanced functions, but keeps the basic GPWS functions operative. An amber memo TAR off is displayed. In case of failure of the enhanced functions, the fault light comes on with an ECAM caution, but the basic GPWS functions remain operative. Note: the basic mode 1 to 5 of the GPWS are still available provided the SYS push button switch is not lighted. The GPWS uses a terrain database, coupled with a GPS position, to calculate 2 terrain envelopes ahead of the aircraft. When a conflict is detected between these terrain envelopes and the terrain memorized in the database, an alert is triggered. One terrain envelope corresponds to a caution level, while the second one corresponds to a warning level.
Terrain ahead.
If the TAD detects a terrain collision threat ahead of the aircraft, the
Terrain
following
ahead.
are triggered. A caution, if the aircraft is approximately 60 seconds away from the conflict terrain. An amber, turn ahead, message appears on the NDs. A terrain ahead,
Terrain
oral
ahead.
alert is repeated every 7 seconds until the threat disappears. The areas which violate the
Terrain
warning
ahead.
envelope turn to a solid amber color.
Terrain ahead. Pull up. Terrain
If the
ahead.
TAD detects a
Pull up.
terrain collision threat ahead of the
ahead.
aircraft,
Pull
the
up.
following are triggered.
Terrain
A
ahead.
warning,
Pull
if the
up.
aircraft is approximately
Terrain
30
ahead.
seconds
Pull
away
up.
from the conflict terrain.
Terrain ahead.
And red,
Pull
turn
up.
ahead, message appears on the
Terrain ahead.
NDs.
Pull
A
up.
terrain ahead,
Terrain
pull up,
ahead.
terrain
Pull
ahead,
up.
pull up. Oral alert
Terrain
is
ahead.
repeated
Pull
continuously until the threat
Terrain
disappears.
ahead. Pull
The
up.
areas which violate the
Terrain
warning
ahead.
envelope turn
Pull
to a
up.
solid red color.
Terrain ahead. Pull up. Terrain ahead. Pull up. Terrain ahead. Pull up.
As for the basic GPWS warnings, crews should react immediately without attempting to assess its validity. In case of caution or warning, if terrain on ND is not selected on, the terrain display is set automatically to on and the on light on the terrain on ND push button switch comes on.
Obstacle ahead. Obstacle ahead.
If the TAD detects an obstacle collision threat ahead of the aircraft, the following are triggered.
Obstacle
A caution,
ahead.
if the
Obstacle
aircraft is
ahead.
approximately 60 seconds away from the conflict terrain. An amber, obst ahead, message appears on the
Obstacle ahead.
NDs and
Obstacle
a
ahead.
obstacle ahead, obstacle ahead. Oral alert is repeated every 7 seconds until the threat
Obstacle
disappears.
ahead. Obstacle ahead. Obstacle ahead. Pull up. Obstacle ahead. Pull up. Obstacle
If the
ahead.
TAD detects
Pull
an
up.
obstacle
Obstacle
collision threat
ahead.
ahead of the
Pull up.
aircraft, the
Obstacle
following are
ahead.
triggered.
Pull up.
A warning,
Obstacle
if the
ahead.
aircraft
Pull
is
up.
approximately 30
Obstacle
seconds
ahead.
away from the
Pull up.
conflict terrain.
Obstacle
A
ahead.
red,
Pull
obst
up.
ahead,
Obstacle
message appears
ahead.
on the
Pull
NDs
up.
and a
Obstacle
obstacle
ahead.
ahead,
Pull up.
pull up, obstacle ahead,
Pull up.
pull up.
Obstacle
Oral alert
ahead.
is repeated
Pull up.
continuously until
Obstacle
the threat
ahead.
disappears.
Pull up. Obstacle ahead. Pull up. Obstacle ahead. Pull up.
The second eGPWS protective function provides a terrain clearance floor envelope for each runway stored in the database. This function warns of a premature descent below this floor regardless of aircraft configuration.
The Runway Field Clearance Floor, RFCF, is an additional envelope protection for runways that are significantly higher than the surrounding terrain. RFCF protection ensures that the aircraft remains 300 feet above the runway elevation within the last 5.5 nautical miles. It is based on the geometric altitude and the runway elevation. The relative height is calculated using the geometric altitude. The geometric altitude is based on the radio altitude and GPS altitude in order to reduce borrow settings errors. The GPS provided data used for computation are valid and accurate.
When the aircraft position accuracy provided by the FMGS is low, the enhanced functions of the Enhanced Ground Proximity Warning System are automatically deselected. TARE Standby appears in green on the ECAM memo, and the terrain display is deselected until a high level of navigation accuracy is restored. The basic ground proximity warning system functions remain operative.